4X games have been around for a very long time, certainly longer than I've had access to a computer. Modern versions are pretty popular within the strategy community, with titles such as Civ and Stellaris being excellent representations of the genre. But where did it all start? Hi, I'm Calvin, and today we're going to look at the birth of 4X games and how they took shape in their formative years. 4X games are a divergence of grand strategy, and today the differences are a lot more pronounced than they used to be. I'm not sure of an exact definition, but it's normally easy to tell them apart by a few simple checks. If the game you're playing features exploration and a greater focus on diplomacy and trade, then it's probably a 4X. If the focus is more on conquest and waging war, then the chances are it's grand strategy. The term 4X wasn't actually coined until many years after the birth of this particular genre. It's normally credited to writer Alan Emmerich and is associated with his sneak preview of 1993's Master of Orion. He thought it would be both apt and funny to rate his game 4X, as a play on the XXX rating normally associated with adult material. He explains in the article that it features the essential 4 X's of any good strategic conquest game: explore, expand, exploit and exterminate. But as he alludes to in his article, strategic conquest games have been around long before Master of Orion was ever conceived. I probably don't have to tell you that strategy games of one sort or another have been ever present throughout human history. The ancient Egyptians had something called Senet, which is believed to be one of the earliest contenders we have evidence for, and predates the early access pre-order of chess by a good few thousand years. These early games had plenty of strategy and extermination, but they lacked the exploration and expansion that would be seen in far more modern games. As mass manufacturing capabilities improved and people had to spend less of their time on bothersome matters like growing enough food to eat and not dying in a war, the sorts of games people played would end up diversifying and allowing a little more complexity. Board games throughout the 20th century are a topic for someone more knowledgeable, so instead we're going to start our particular story with Conquest, a game of strategy from 1972. Think of it like a more advanced version of Risk. The various pieces, soldiers, elephants, chariots, knights and ships, have different combat and movement characteristics and actually interact with each other. You can place soldiers on top of chariots to move them around faster, and then place those chariots onto ships to cross the seas. The original version of the game just included some cardboard tokens, but later versions included models that actually stacked to better represent soldiers riding elephants and so on. The aim of the game is to occupy your opponent's capital. Sounds easy enough, but by the time you take the deployment, movement and combat rules into account, the level of complexity does start to grow. This isn't a problem for Conquest, it's very playable, but it's still a very basic representation of events, which does demonstrate the problem that board games can have when they are trying to replicate something as complex as strategy on a global or galactic scale. The more accurate you try to make the representation, the more time players have to spend digging through rulebooks, supplements and calculations between each move, slowing the game down to a glacial pace. There will always be a tiny niche that thrives on this sort of thing, but for most people it would remove the fun from an otherwise enjoyable pastime. Luckily, help was just around the corner in the form of the personal computer. If you think about it, PCs are the perfect tool for strategy games. Even the early ones that didn't have much in the way of graphics were excellent at number crunching and processing a predetermined set of logic rules. This allowed the creation of far more advanced strategy games or simulations without the user having to do all of those calculations themselves, with the added benefit that the computer could also provide an opponent for the player to contend with, on the occasion they didn't have the opportunity or wish to engage with anyone else. Unburdened by the restrictions of game boards, physical pieces, rulebooks and basic representations, strategy video games could grow in complexity in a way that would never be possible on top of your dining room table. This allowed additional elements like economy, production and exploration to join the more fighty elements, and would result in Reach for the Stars, Conquest of the Galaxy. Released in 1983, Reach for the Stars was written and developed by Roger Keating and Ian Trout and based on a 1974 board game called Stellar Conquest. It was available for several early systems, originally for Commodore 64 and Apple, and then later for Amiga and DOS in 1988. Like all games from the early 80s, it's graphically very basic, but it does have a decent level of complexity under the hood. The star map shows a list of systems either free for the taking or held by a player. You can construct scout ships to explore these territories with a mine for later occupation. The production menu lets you build starships of various marks, armies, tech upgrades, and once you've constructed some combat forces, you can place them into task groups and send them out to create mischief. The population of your planet directly reflects on the economics involved, and its growth is decided by a mix of social level and raw population. But overpopulation leads to its own problems and must be managed carefully. The game manual does have something to say about this, declaring that the ungrateful populace will riot, reducing industry and social level and hopefully killing some of themselves off in the process. I don't really know how to play Reach for the Stars. I did have a cursory look to satisfy my own curiosity, but I think it would take several playthroughs and careful study of the manual to draw any detailed conclusions. Considering that each game takes 12 to 24 hours to complete and the manual consists of 30 pages of text, I made the decision that perhaps it wasn't for me. The fact that the appendix section of the manual contains a colony record sheet for you to photocopy to help you keep track of your conquests should tell you all you need to know about the level of commitment required to become fully invested in the game. But we had to start somewhere, and although finding the first of anything is normally a tricky business, highly dependent on opinion, I think Reach for the Stars is probably a good contender for the first true 4X game. The 1980s saw other titles that ticked many of these boxes, several of them based on popular board games of the time, with titles such as 1985's Strategic Conquest for the Apple II, which featured cities and a world map, instead of planets and a galaxy. This was shortly followed by another Stars and Ships offering under the slightly unwieldy title of Anacreon Reconstruction 4021. It provided a mostly text-based view of your universe, and feels more akin to using the management system of a large logistics firm than it does to playing a game. It's still packed with features, more so than its predecessors, and it does include things that would later become staples like diplomatic messaging and trade. However, as with many of these early titles, you're immediately thrown in at the deep end with no time to learn the mechanics and little hope of understanding its complexities. I'm sure the game came with its own essential thick manual, but unfortunately I was unable to find a copy. As we drew closer to the 90s, these games would start to make better use of a graphical user interface and sometimes a mouse. They had the same basic premise and operation, with pages of data, spreadsheets and tables, but they were starting to become slightly easier to navigate, although it was still impossible to intuit anything, and gameplay was next to impossible without spending a long time with your head buried neck deep in the pages of the user manual. These games also continued along a trend where the box art would continually write checks that the engine could never hope to cash. This one is my particular favourite. Just look at it, it's amazing. It almost looks like something an AI could have come up with after a particularly mad prompt. First released in 1990 for Mac, the cover of Spacewood Ho conjures up so many images in the mind, and although you might have expected a great many things from it, an interface reminiscent of the monitoring software from a water treatment plant is probably not one of them. Unlike the platformers, RPGs and Sims of the 80s, strategy games just didn't look like games, they looked like software. That was until 1991, when Sid Meier's Civilization was released. It took the essential concepts established in previous strategic titles and built them into something that for the first time actually looked and felt like a video game. Discovery, colony management, diplomacy and war weren't new concepts, but the way Civ weaved them into a simple interface with colourful but intuitive graphics had never been done before. It stood head and shoulders above anything that had come before it, and it did all this while expanding the complexity of the underlying model rather than reducing it. The colony management, research paths and diplomatic options that it established have become the foundation for the entire genre, and its influence can be felt in pretty much every 4X game that followed it. As impactful as all that was, this was only part of its success. From the introduction onwards, Civ made amazing use of basic animations and images to bridge the gaps left by limitations in early user interfaces. Every time you meet another leader, establish a new settlement, or discover a new technology, you're presented with something that creates a direct connection between your intentions and the results of your actions. Working alongside this is the inbuilt tutorial system that provides important information as you go, and a built-in encyclopedia containing everything you could ever want to know about the game. You didn't have to move your attention away from the monitor to search through a manual, nor did you have to spend ages looking at screens full of figures and numbers to determine if your actions had the desired effect. It was all there, right in front of you, and it created a level of engagement that had not yet been possible with the genre. The next year wouldn't see much in the way of new 4X games, and it's not hard to see why. If you were already working on such a game, then it would have looked so badly dated on release that it probably wasn't worth finishing. And if you had just started thinking about a new game, then you would have to throw all of your planning out the window and start fresh. This would change in 1993 with the first 4X game to be actually described as such, Master of Orion. It wasn't anything as crass as a copy of Civilization, and it would be deeply unfair and plain wrong to just describe it as being Civ in space, as the gameplay is quite different. Rather than copy the function or form of Civilization, it instead took the same concepts popularised by the space-based conquest games of the 80s and applied the lessons learned from Civ to them. Those lessons being, a game should probably look and feel like a game if you want people to play it, and it should be easy to understand and control so that the first few days of playtime are spent looking at the screen rather than the manual. I spent a lot of time in Master of Orion as a kid. It was one of the first games I remember that really felt like it transported you to a different place entirely, and when you look at the alien faces and futuristic UI, it's not hard to see why. It was also one of the first times I played a strategy game on this scale that gave you some agency over the actual combat engagements themselves. You couldn't pull out a win with the odds stacked against you, well, I couldn't anyway, but you could certainly get better outcomes in more even battles with the right amount of careful and deliberate decision making. Like Civ, Master of Orion would create the template for future releases, and if you became familiar with it, then it wasn't difficult to get to grips with many of the other space conquest games that followed. Also, like Civ, it had remarkable endurance. It's fondly remembered by many and has had several successful sequels over the years. The first decade of 4X was an extremely important era for strategy games. The growing availability of home computers made the move from pen and paper possible, and the later improvements in PC technology allowed these games to grow from text-based representations to graphically rich game environments that were deep, rewarding, and easy to engage with. Civilization and Master of Orion showed strategy fans what games on this scale could and should look like, and the next decade of 4X would be rich with refinements and new ideas as others tried to compete with these games and their inevitable sequels. Hi there, I hope that today's presentation met your 4 expectations, and if you like what you saw then click the like button. You can leave a comment or join the Discord if you've got something to add, and if you want more of this sort of thing then subscribe to my channel and I hope to see you back soon.